I wanted to say at the beginning, because when Dr. Thomas asked me to do this lecture, if that's what we'll call it a lecture on hooping, and I'm honored to do it. And I thought about it. I say, in every case, hooping comes at the end. You know what I mean? It comes at the end, and so this is definitely something different when hooping comes at the beginning. The opening lecture of the conference is about hooping, but I am just honored and blessed to be able to be here and to share, and thank God for this privilege that we have to share. Now, my understanding is that I'm going to give you a little bit of what I have here, and then we are going to exchange and talk some together, your comments and questions as well on the lecture. And Dr. Thomas has explained to me that that's how we get better, and how we zero in on even fixing what may need to be undergirded within this lecture so that we can develop something even further. And of course, you already know there's a class as well, and Dr. Bridget Franklin is working with me in that class, and so everything else that we need to know, she's going to help us get it during the course of these next few days. Like a sermon, I'm going to start this lecture with a text. It will come from Isaiah 58:1, which you are familiar with, and it's from the easy-to-read version of Scripture. How about that? Isaiah 58:1. Here's what it says: "Shout as loud as you can and don't stop. Shout like a trumpet. Tell the people what they did wrong. Tell the family of Jacob about their sins." NIV captures that second phrase like this: "Raise your voice like a trumpet." And if this was something to preach, I would call it "Let the Trumpet Sound." Chicago's Gregory Macon was preaching revival at the New Community Baptist Church in Detroit. The one night out of 5 that I attended was the peak night. Just as Macon tuned up and headed toward the close of his sermon, tall, lanky Mississippi Jones shouted out, "Cry loud and spare not." Macon and all the other preachers present knew what that meant. It was the ultimate push forward, telling the preacher to take us home. Cry loud and spare not was the justification for hooping. According to an entire generation of preachers, they believed that cry loud and spare not was the biblical way of telling preachers to hoop it out. None of these seasoned proclaimers of the gospel could see the prophets of Scripture doing anything but hooping. God's orders to shout as loud as you can, or as the Message Bible say, a full-throated shout, could not be fulfilled by someone lecturing or giving a motivational speech. This kind of order is fulfilled only by hooping unapologetically. In the black church, we hoop. Not all black preachers hoop, and not every congregation experiences hooping every Sunday morning. Yet there are hundreds of thousands of black preachers who possess the gift and ability to hoop, and their voices are heard in the pulpits all over this country and beyond. Hooping is here, and I'm convinced that it's here to stay. Hooping has received mixed reviews. There are those who believe that hooping is mainly for the purpose of entertainment. They think preachers who hoop are pandering to the people and is promoting emotionalism and showmanship. Those who are skeptical about hooping think it should cease as a part of black worship, and preachers should choose other methods for concluding their sermons. The Cistercian scholar Allen of Lisle, born in 1128, died in 1202, provided the first formal definition of preaching in the 1200-year history of the church. In his definition of preaching, Allen, who is an influential figure in the so-called Renaissance of the 12th century, as well as in the whole history of preaching, uses the language that is carried over through centuries to express disdain for preaching that has musicality, suggesting that is theatrical and full of buffoonery. Allen said, preaching should not contain jesting words or childish remarks, or that melodiousness and harmony which results from the use of rhythm or metric lines. These are better fitted to delight the ear than to edify the soul. Such preaching is theatrical and full of buffoonery, and in every way to be condemned. So says Allen of Lisle. It is no wonder that these same words are used today by those who view hooping as problematic. E. Trey Clark, in his book, Black Contemplative Preaching, describes another aspect of black preaching that he believes has been overlooked. Clark argues that contemplative or reflective preaching of the sort engaged by Howard Thurman, Barbara Harris, or Martin Luther King Jr. has been somewhat diminished by the more emotional and energetic preaching for which the black church is known. Clark says the most obvious distinctive of black contemplative preaching is its meditative homiletical style. It almost never involves hooping. Clark goes on to say that contemplative preaching has its celebrative dimension. However, it is achieved with less of what commonly accompanies the idea of black preaching. We should not mistake volume or emotionalism as vehicles taking away from the depth of the meaning of black preaching, because preaching is ecstatic or may contain hooping does not necessarily mean that the preacher is non-contemplative. Hooping has meant much to the black church, and it is difficult to think of the black church without it. Hooping has been and is still an integral part of black preaching. We should discuss it and study it and celebrate it for the history it has held and for the promise that it brings. What then is hooping? Hooping is vocal music while preaching. The tonal and rhythmic vocalization during the close of a sermon in the African American preaching experience. It includes rhetorical content along with heightening and stretching tones with musical flavor. Hooping reaches for the emotive and provides the opportunity for the sermon to become a communal experience. Both art and science, hooping rests upon the musical keys and follows the minor scale. Hooping is a creative expression of the gift of voice. John Michael Spencer writes, that which is variously referred to as hooping, intoning, chanting, moaning, or tuning is essentially melody. This particular style of melody is definable as a series of cohesive pitches which have continuity, tonality, quasi-metrical phraseology, and formulary cadence. Spencer tends to lump the various aspects of hooping into one. Well, I agree that hooping is melody. However, some of the particular aspects alone are not considered hooping. They are all distinct and different. Martha Simmons continues this definition of hooping by saying, hooping is first melody, one that can be identified by the fact that its pitches are logically connected and have prescribed punctuated rhythms that require certain modulations of the voice, and is often delineated by quasi-metrical phrasing. Hooping has melody, but is not melody alone. Melody may be used in the expression of many forms of speech and song. Melody provides musical movement. However, melody does not fulfill the idea of hooping on its own. Melody requires something more before it adequately shifts towards hooping. Unlike singing, hooping is distinctive and has its own rhythm and cadence. Hooping is done in a specific key, and the common range is approximately an octave and a half. Teresa Fry Brown notes, the melody of speech is determined by the mood, emotions, intonation, and flavor of the voice of the speaker. Better speakers produce speech in a range of 1.5 octaves and rising and falling of stressed syllables. Although hooping has musical components, hooping is not singing. Hooping has a tune, but not all tuning is hooping. Hooping has a wide range of components, including tuning, cruising, crooning, squalling, pulling it, yanking it, and even more. Rhythm is involved in hooping. This rhythm is based upon the breathing pattern of the preacher, because only a certain number of words or syllables can be uttered between breaths. The pattern affixed to hooping is the result of the words, phrases, and expressions uttered between breaths. Often the preacher who hoops also has a hack. You all know about that. The hack, or ha, happens at the end of each breath the preacher takes. Zora Neale Hurston shares that the well-known ha of the Negro preacher is a breathing device. It is the tail end of the expulsion just before inhalation. Many preachers allow this breath to come out hard, and it produces a hacking sound. When this breath ends hard, the preacher is known as a hacker. When the preacher's breath closes softly, the preacher can avoid having a distinguishable hack. This makes for smoother movement from one breath to the next. When the preacher inhales, it can be soft or hard. A hard inhale is extremely noticeable and becomes a signature feature of the preacher. Some people have referred to hard breathing as being asthmatic. However, breathing is an important aspect of hooping and should be done carefully and skillfully when preaching. According to Fry Brown, voicing the word includes respiration, hearing, vocal energy, breath control, pitch, volume, pacing, rate, pausing, intensity, duration, rhythm, intonation, and inflection. Fry Brown focuses on the use of voice in preaching and gives us an overall view of what is included in vocality. Breathing is controlled. It is key to maintaining a solid whoop throughout the conclusion of a sermon. A sporadic whoop that is on and off or up and down is likely when there's no rhythm during the presentation. Some preachers close each point of their sermon whooping and returns to conversational tone as they move to the next point. Often in Pentecostalism, we would see that. For many members of the black church, specifically those who were nurtured in congregations where the pastor hooped, hooping is preaching. Lerone Martin refers to Hurston in expressing this sentiment. For many black listeners, this homiletic formula constituted black Protestant preaching. As Zora Neale Hurston discovered in her interwar fieldwork, a good many African Americans deemed the folk chanted sermon the only true form of preaching. Anything else, according to them, was lecturing, or even worse, trying to sound like a white man. Through the years, some parishioners in the black church have reported that after the service, the pastor lectured or talked to us today. This was their way of saying that the sermon was delivered without a hoop to close it out. For so many black people, hooping is preaching. Aretha Franklin said of her father, C.L. Franklin, when he would get into what I call high or third gear, it was called hooping. Later, Harry Belafonte called Daddy a super hooper, a description that made me smile, she said. I second that emotion. It is also called a squall. Hooping is a powerful and highly rhythmic way of preaching in which words take the form of song, half speech, half melody, according to Aretha Franklin. A part of the history of hooping, Dr. Henry Mitchell said, preaching is carried out in the idiom, imagery, style, and worldview of a particular people. Mitchell is right in saying that preaching is in the worldview of a particular people. African American people have the rhythm and cadence of African folk even to this day. Much of the movement and sounds associated with worship and celebration that we find in worship services today is connected historically with movement and sound that goes all the way back to Africa. Mitchell goes on to say, so if African blacks sound remarkably like some traditional Africans in worship, speaking of African traditional religion, it is only natural. Slave bosses could change the length of holes and the manner of cultivating crops, but they could not change how the slaves believed, nor how they prayed and sang at night in their cabins, or in the unlawful gathering in the brush arbors and the like. African culture crossed the waters and entered the Americas with those who were transported as slaves. In their secret places of spiritual worship and the sounds and movements of African traditionalism, it could be heard and observed. When it comes to hooping, the methodology involved is well associated with African culture. Mitchell observes there is good reason to believe that African culture influenced all black preachers in their use of a tonally pleasing voice. with or without intentional moaning or chanting. Mitchell continues, the tone scale, as well as the mentioned call and response patterns, are West African also. And you all know church would not be what church is for us without call and response. It is only fitting to note that the emotionalism and artistic musicality that describes hooping connects with African culture. As Mitchell says, thousands of Africans from diverse cultures and religious traditions forcefully transported to America as slaves retained many African customs even as they were converted to Christianity. The Christian conversion of slaves allowed for many of the manners and behaviors associated with African worship to be continued and even further developed. People of African descent continued to embrace their familiar customs and traditions. Then again, it is out of the backdrop of the Second Great Awakening that the preaching of Whitefield, who is often referred to as Whitfield, that tune and rhythm were added to fiery preaching. Generations later, this same type of preaching continued to surface in various parts of the country. The white separatist Baptists in the South devised their own preaching tone. They called it the holy wine. Decades of African American seminary students have been surprised and delighted to learn that what they know as the hoop had and still has in few areas paralleled in some white pulpits. It is interesting to note that there are some white preachers in white churches who also hoop. While there is a distinct difference between the style and manners of hooping for white preachers, the sound and rhythms are similar. Dr. Rod Parsley of the World Harvest Church in Columbus, Ohio, is an example of fiery preaching with melody that is known among some white preachers. Parsley celebrates in high gear with cadence and rhythm along with musical accompaniment. His preaching ministry can be found on YouTube and other media outlets. Noted figures like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, while important to any discussion on black preaching, should be considered. Rosenberg says that we are thus tempted to discount Richard Allen's influence on the spontaneous chanted sermon, despite his undoubted importance in the early Negro church. Rather, he has been described by those who knew him as plain spoken, matter of fact, young Negro. His words were simple and instructive and sincere. Another historical figure that is important to any discussion on black preaching is John Jasper. Jasper was an ex-slave who became a Baptist preacher and delivered sermons to blacks and whites after the Civil War. His famous sermon, "The Sun Do Move," based upon Joshua 10 and 13, with Joshua asking God to allow Israel's army to be victorious by daylight. It is said that John Jasper preached with such power and conviction that it swayed even those who came to laugh at him. Some slave preachers hooped during their sermons. Many slave preachers practice a style of revivalistic preaching that has come to be called the chanted sermon because of its rhythmic structure and musical tones alone. In this kind of sermon, the preacher began calmly and slowly, then gradually built up to a quicker, more excited pace. The words set to a regular beat, reinforced by the congregation's shouts of amen and preach it. Finally, he reached an emotional peak in which the chanted words of the sermon merged with the singing and clapping and shouting of the congregation. Rabbitoh helps us see worship among slaves as their preachers who identified with their plight in life, interpreted and proclaimed the word of God in their own expression. It was an experience shared by the preacher and the congregation. The rhythm and cadence connected with worshipers and made the preaching come alive. Then there was also Reverend James M. Gates out of Hogansville, Georgia. However, at the time of his prominence, he was pastor of a church in Atlanta. Gates, who pastored Mount Calvary Baptist Church, was chosen by several record companies to record short sermons on long-playing records for sale on the market. Although Gates was not the first to record sermons for the public, he was the first to have the level of success that he enjoyed. Gates was a hooper, and his often delightful sermons attracted people to hear him preach and to purchase recordings. Gates' first recorded sermon was "Death's Black Train is Coming." In a combined singing and preaching format, Gates' recordings sold at record pace in the black religious community. One of Gates' most popular sermons was "The Devil in the Flying Machine." If you haven't heard it, you got to hear that one. As he chided those who boarded airplanes headed for destinations around the world, Gates hooped on his sermons with an audience of just a few men and women providing responses to his preaching. Also, at that same time, Benjamin J. Perkins was a popular and gifted preacher who was known for his hoop. Perkins pastored the Mount Ham Baptist Church, the oldest black church in Jackson, Mississippi, from 1912 to 1919. He served as an officer in the administration of the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated. He also gave leadership to several congregations during his ministerial career. According to the history of Mount Ham Baptist Church, his emotional preaching style resulted in standing room only services, with many people standing outside the church to hear his sermons. Reverend Benjamin Hooks, pastor and attorney who later became head of the NAACP, thought of Ben Perkins as the greatest of all hoopers. The impact of B.J. Perkins' preaching was felt and known during his ministry. His ability to hoop in his own unique way was a phenomenon in the black pulpit. The preacher with the most impact in the 20th century is Clarence LaVon Franklin. He was born in 1915 in Sunflower County, Mississippi. Franklin became the prototype for hooping in the African American preaching experience. And I'll be looking closely at Frank, as he was commonly called by those close to him. C.L. Franklin began preaching after B.J. Perkins delivered a sermon in the Mississippi General Baptist State Convention. It was during the preaching of B.J. Perkins that Franklin felt the call to ministry. C.L. Franklin came to Detroit after pastoring churches in Mississippi, Tennessee, and New York. In 1946, Franklin was selected as pastor for the New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit. Through a relationship with Jovan Battles, Franklin recorded over 75 sermons on LPs. Franklin's popular sermons sold in record number. One of Franklin's most popular sermons was "The Eagle Stirs Her Nest." His sermon was taken from the book of Deuteronomy, and Franklin describes the method by which an eagle trains her young to fly. Franklin closed the message with a pristine hoop that became the prototype. The earlier version of The Eagle Stirs Her Nest was recorded in 1953. This version ended with the story of an eagle caged in and finally set free. Franklin scales the heights of hooping as he says, "One of these days, my soul will take wings." Frank, as he was affectionately called, squalled at the closing of the sermon. Franklin preached a later version of The Eagle Stirs Her Nest in 1976 on the evening of the close of his pastoral anniversary. In this later version, it was obvious that Franklin had matured and his outlook expanded. He seemed more conscious of the plight of black people in America and addressed it in the sermon. The black migration by the millions from the South to the North was God stirring the nest, he said. Franklin's voice had also matured as he reinvented his hoop. He no longer topped out on the octave. He pulled it and grinded on a lower note as he carried the sermon to its crescendo. One of these days, the nest will be stirred the last time, and I'm going to leave this old battleground. I'm going up a little higher. Yes, I am. Oh, yeah, he exclaimed. The audience was in pandemonium, the music sweeping, and the experience ended on a high note. I was privileged to ask Reverend Franklin which of his recorded sermons were most dear to him, to which he replied, "The Inner Conflict." This sermon was preached in the 1950s and was taken from the book of Romans and described the human and spiritual dilemma that causes our internal struggles with evil. In that sermon, he states, "The same thing that goes on in her goes on in you and me." This was in reference to the natural urges that accompany adolescence. He further confesses his own struggle with evil, saying, "I find myself doing wrong all the time, asking the Lord to help me." In listening to The Inner Conflict, there was a continued sense of surrender to the Spirit of God and recognition of human weakness. Franklin again concludes with hooping to celebrate the power of God to provide us with spiritual discipline and control. Well, it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. But I want to close this lecture with these words. Hooping today has come a long way from hooping in the beginning of the 20th century. However, the same spirit of capturing the essence of soul exists. Reverend Donald L. Parsons, Leroy Elliott, Gina Stewart, Tellis Chapman, James Perkins, Frank Ray, William Curtis, Paul Morton, and a broad array of others have made their contributions to black preaching. There are those preachers like Tolan Morgan, Philip Porter, Shaletta Fomby, Elliot Ivy, George Parks, John Terris Tate, Jennifer Garner, Charles Goodman, and many others who bring brand new gifts to hooping. We have seen and heard hooping today like never before. We can only wonder what Gates or Franklin would say about the distance hooping has come. There will always be those who look upon hooping with disdain. There will be those who will see hooping as an expression of illiteracy or buffoonery. Some will suggest that hoopers are merely performers or religious entertainers. However, it should not be overlooked that many of the pastors who hoop on Sunday mornings are hard-working ministers of the gospel who have touched the lives of more people than we can count. Souls have been saved and communities have been changed because of their preaching gifts. Despite the criticism and attacks against hooping, every Sunday morning there will be tens of thousands of black preachers hooping from their pulpit, with thousands of others who would hoop if they could. Thank you and bless you.
One of the things that we have been talking back and forth about is that hooping has been discussed in off stage, back in the hallways, and that hooping is an art form. And I think what your lecture does is it brings it up as an art form worthy of discussion, on par with all of the various forms of preaching. And so I'm gonna go inside to you. How did it feel to bring it all together, particularly in light of where we started in CPI? So to get here and deliver it, how did it feel inside?
Well, one of the things, as you mentioned, it seems as if as much as hooping goes on in this country, pulpits all over the place, Sunday mornings, not to mention in revivals that go on across this country. But on the main stages of many of our conferences, conventions, whatever, it is rarely mentioned. It is almost as if hooping is something that black people love. Many black people love. Some, have their issues with it, but many black people love, but still have reservations about. Who do not feel proud of it, and who probably do not feel, as you just mentioned, that it is of par with every other discipline within the rubric of preaching. Yeah.
Well, I've pushed him to have the first conference on hooping. Just have a conference on it, to lift it up out of the shadows, to pull it out of the darkness. It can be discussed and talked about. And it has strengths and weaknesses. It has some buffoonery and it has some ignorance, but it has also some genius. And we spend most of our time on the genius of it, not necessarily the ignorance of it. And I want you too to comment on, we talked about the strand of women hoopers. You mentioned some of that at the end. So talk a little bit too about not only is it typically is characterized as a male form of that only men hoop, but Tell me about some of what you found when you were looking around.
You and I discussed a mutual friend from years back, Dr. Brenda Little, out of Evanston, Illinois, who was a major hooper. She was, yeah. And some of the things that were said about her back in those days, this was back in the 80s, when we first brought her to our church to preach in Detroit. At that time, of course, there were few women preaching, period, and certainly even fewer hoopers among women. And it was said of her often, as a preacher who hooped, trying to be like a man, trying to sound like a man, but she, there was another, Brenda Kearney, who was a tremendous hooper among women preachers. And of course, now the list goes on. I mean, and one of the strongest women preaching out here now is Dorinda Clark. I mean, a masterful hooper, and it is a good number, and of course, I have a list of others as well. But I mentioned Gina Stewart and Jennifer Garner, who graces this room, who are just tremendous at hooping, and so we hope that we will be able to uplift more and to see more women mastering the gift that they possess without any reservation and without, feeling as if hooping is something that has to just be done at late night, or anything, or in the back room or something like that. So we hope that it will get the recognition it deserves.
I'm going to take 2 audience questions, and then we're going to end it. Any questions anybody wants to? Yes, come on, Dr. Angela Edwards.
I just wanted to ask Dr. Branch, back in the day I was in the Bible Belt in Nashville, Tennessee, and those who I experienced that hooped would walk the pews and climb chairs. So I was wondering, in your research, did you find anything about how the body movement, its voice, but also the movement of the body becomes a part of the process? So I was just wondering, did that come up for you?
As a teenager, I was organist for the Antioch Baptist Church, pastored by the late Dr. W.N. Daniel. W.N. Daniel pastored the Pilgrim Emmanuel Baptist Church in Nashville, Tennessee. W.N. Daniel would climb all up across the pulpits. He would walk the pews. He would do everything once he get going, and it didn't take him long to do it either. And so it was always, including the voice, the gesturing, the movement. Many of the preachers who hoop would also come down from the pulpit and come down and into the audience. They would shake hands with people while they are hooping and walking along, and while people, and by the time they touched their hand, folk was shouting, roll. You had to pull them out from under the pews, and all this kind of thing. And of course, many of the revivals, they were 5 nights back in those days, and by the time you get to Thursday, Friday night, it was up here, and so it was a lot of that. So it did include, and still does for that matter, maybe not as much, but it still includes a lot of mannerisms and gestures and body movements and all of that, because the preacher puts everything into it. And in my lecture on some of that I skipped right past, I was referring to the scripture where the psalmist in Psalm 103 said, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me." So that we do not overlook the emotionalism and suggest, because some people say, it ain't about the emotionalism. Well, no, worship is not all about the emotionalism, but emotionalism is a part of worship. And so if we don't reach the emotions, we probably won't reach the person. And so emotionalism and this form of ecstatic rapture that occurs in worship at the close of that message, when that sermon becomes communal and everybody is involved in it, was something that gave folk something to hold on throughout the whole week. And they come back next Sunday looking for the same thing.
Thank you.
One more.
Last comment.
Dr. Branch, I'm curious. We know we has a form. Your organist has a set of chords he's going to use behind you. They're not random. There's a theory to it. So my question is, has anybody notated a hoop musically?
You know, this is that's a good question. And I did mention that hooping is done in a minor key. It's done on a pentonic scale. It is five of the 8 notes of the octave. And come on, man. You see, that's what happens. You know, you see, the preacher just be trying to talk about what the preacher talking about. You see, and then here y'all come. Yeah, you know, and then yeah. And then you make the preacher act up. But yes, to your question. Yeah. And then Spencer does in his book, you know, the chanted sermon, he has the notes there on the musical scale that you can see that the chanted sermon, you know how it goes. And no matter who it is, how they're preaching or whatever, there's some hoopers who we just call drivers. The drivers will land on a key and it's high in their vocal range and they drive at that key. See, but there are other hoopers who, even though in their argument they build up, but they build up so that they can reach the top of their range, but then they break down so that they have some range to work with. And so they have an octave above them and at least a half octave below them, below their key, you see. And so then that's where preachers like C.L. Franklin, Jasper Williams, and others, you know, can have room to modulate and also to top out. You know, that's when they pull it. When they hit that squall, it's on that octave, that top note, you know, and very few go above that top note, you know, because that's why they're setting it there. And, you know, so, you know, hooping, and I've said before that no matter how long a person who hoops have been hooping, they can still improve it. There's always room for improvement. So learning how to use it, how to connect the hoop with the sermon that you preach. Because not all sermons that you preach, sermons that are more didactic, that are, you know, you preaching from, you know, from the Romans, or, you know, from second to third John, you know, you are likely to preach a sermon that will not end with a hoop. You know, you will celebrate, because celebration is about the grace that's found in the text. You know, but you won't include the hoop in that celebration. And so, you know, it's always room for improvement in terms of understanding about the hoop. And I wish that more people, more preachers in particular, would understand what hooping really is about, so that some of the statements that are made about hoopers, you know, will be kind of tempered, so that there would be better understanding, so that preachers who do not hoop will not say mean things about those who do, and those who do hoop will not say mean things about those who don't. Because we're all in this together, just trying to do the best we can with what we got to work with.
Well, thank you, Dr. Branch. I'm gonna warn you that on the, we have a rate the lecturer, and you're gonna be rated pretty low for not just finishing this off with a hoop. I just want you to know that. Just want you, we can anticipate that, it's gonna be like, he didn't finish it, But thank you so much. Y'all put your hands together for Dr. Branch. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.